But I did notice that China now has an inverted yield curve. Some of you may be asking, what is an inverted yield curve? Well, I'll explain that to you in a second, but this is really notable news. I'm not a macro guy at all. I think you guys know that. But when I see an inverted yield curve, I definitely stop and ask myself what is happening, because it's a very unusual phenomenon. And so basically, long-term bonds always yield more than short-term bonds. That's sort of the nature of borrowing money. You should, to lock up your money for 30 years, you should demand a higher yield. And you can see that right now, I hope you like my handwriting here, right now, borrowing money, the US government can borrow money for 30 years, and it's roughly a 2.5%, 3%, 2.7%, something like that, I forget, kind of yield. And the short end of the curve is more like 1.5% or 2%. So there's sort of a weird dynamic that happens when the yield curve inverts, and it never really inverts too much in terms of sloping downward, but sometimes you'll see a flat yield curve, which is enough to call it inverted, really. And it means that, of course, you can borrow money, or the rate of the short end of the curve is the same or even higher than the far end of the curve, which is a really unique phenomenon. And the last two times this happened, there were two huge recessions right after. And basically the reason this happens is the market, which is somewhat smarter than everyone else. If you think about what the market is, it's this collection of opinions that is pretty clever. The market is sensing that there'll be short-term easing, and that short-term easing is, the short-term interest rate is almost completely what the short end of the curve represents. So if there's going to be short-term easing, basically what will happen is people will in essence sell off those bonds and flatten the curve, and that's sort of what's happening in China right now. I'll get to that in a second. But by selling off the near end of the curve, investors are expecting that whatever regulatory or I should say monetary body exists, they'll sort of ease to help the economy, which presumably is slowing, and that easing, of course, will result in lower interest rates. So it's a pretty simple concept, but it is a rare phenomenon, and almost always is a pretty good predictor of weak economic activity. So China, you can see this is the spread between 5s and 10s, and you can see that they've inverted. Now, the media made a big deal out of this. If you look at the actual yield curve, there is a lot of flattening, but it's still not quite totally flat. A little while ago, it was quite a steep curve, and now we've got quite a much flatter curve, the red line being the most recent curve here. So anyway, we're seeing that flattening in China, which is pretty scary. China's economy is almost as big as the US now, so it's worth paying attention to. We haven't seen it in the US yet. We still have a very healthy yield curve here, as you can see, which I think bodes well for equities. But in China, the flattening of the yield curve is very scary. That could drag the whole world down. And how you might manifest that in a bet, I'm not so sure. You can actually bet on a steepener if you wanted. You can, I always get the yields and things like that mixed up, but you can definitely bet on the near end of the curve by buying it and hoping yields will go down. You can short the far end of the curve and hope that yields go up. So that's sort of the way you'd play a steepener or a flattener. But I think this kind of thing is really important to look at. And I also noticed the Case-Shiller Home Price Index is finally back to the 2007 levels, which is really kind of interesting. What to make of that exactly, I'm not sure, but it's important to kind of know how other asset classes are performing, things like bonds and real estate and things like that. So anyway, let's look at some healthcare stocks. Regeneron continues to rock and roll. I'm so proud and happy that it's been a good pick for me. I will have to eventually dive into that French stock, Abivax. I still haven't had the time to do it, but Abivax with their so-called HIV cure could be really compelling and interesting. And then finally, Valeant has been having this huge comeback. The funny thing about geometric returns, of course, as I hope all of you know, is that when you fall from 200 to 10, you need something crazy like a 2,000% return to fix a 95% decline. So it's very hard to make a comeback from kind of the, such a large fall in the stock. So the fact that the stock's rising a little bit, I wouldn't get too excited or too interested. Some people call it a dead cat bounce. I call it a dead trashy bounce, but regardless. The Immunomedics drug is really interesting. They cut the deal with Seattle Genetics, so that deal has been dropped. And I initially had some skepticism about this drug, but I have to look into it a little bit more because it could be pretty exciting stuff. Of course, AstraZeneca had some PD-1 news. I'll talk about that in a second. Allergan had some I don't know, the quarter was fine, I thought, and the stock dropped. It'll be interesting to sort of see how that plays out. Insight is a stock I'm short, and Acadia is a stock I'm short, and both stocks have dropped dramatically, which is nice. Horizon is a stock I didn't have a position in, and I noticed they had a really bad quarter, and I'll talk about that in a second, but I actually think it's worth buying here for maybe a bounce or whatever. GSK rose quite a bit last week. Y'all know I think I'm in GSK. Alexion fell due to a Brazilian raid of their office. And I don't know how law enforcement does things in Brazil. Right now they're pretty rattled about corruption. The president had to step down, I believe, etc. I don't think Alexion's doing anything wrong. I think Alexion's a great buy. Kite had this kind of weird situation. I admittedly have not looked too closely into it, maybe next week. And Dermira also dropped pretty substantially, so I'd like to look into that. But that's kind of what I've been looking at in healthcare, at least in terms of stock prices. Now, interestingly, I've spent a lot of time recently on this hemophilia market, and so hemophilia is something that any pharmaceutical investor will have been familiar with over the last decade or two. Basically, there are these recombinant factors, either factor 8 or factor 9, and I think there's even a factor 7. But the point is hemophilia A and hemophilia B are caused by deficiency in factor 8 or factor 9, and there are a lot of big drugs that in sum generate about $10 billion. This is really one of the best embodiments of biotechnology. You have these missing proteins that regulate bleeding and thrombosis, and of course in hemophilia, as we all know, there's uncontrolled bleeding, and so the clotting that is helped by this very complex factor cascade. It's not surprising that some things go wrong, and these patients need these either prophylactic or acute episode treatments, and these can actually cost, believe it or not, $1 million a year often, because there's sometimes if you have really uncontrolled bleeding, these patients will have to use a lot of the factor 8 or factor 9. They're really expensive drugs. It's a huge market dominated by a handful of players that you can see here. But I actually think this market would grow even further. I mean, these are really inconvenient, pain in the neck kind of drugs to use. And with these new therapies coming out, which could be curative, and I don't say that word lightly, I kind of call it the C word. I'm always nervous about, cure, just because it's so rare in medicine. But I'll show you in a second that these drugs are actually could be curative. And I think that means the whole market grows. It doesn't mean that these drugs disappear necessarily. They probably will disappear a little bit, or maybe even a lot of it, but they'll be replaced by even bigger drugs coming from these new companies. So who are these new companies? Well, there's a couple of them that are public, and I've bought stock in all of them. Spark, Sangamo, and Unicure are the three companies that I think are going to change the game for hemophilia. So Sangamo licensed one of their drugs to Pfizer, and Sangamo stock jumped in response to that, and Spark licensed their drug to Pfizer a while ago. So Pfizer has a couple of the old drugs, and they need to sort of stay in there. So why are we so excited about this? Well, Spark has shown their data, and their data shows that there's almost a 100% decline in usage of the recombinant factors, factor 8, factor 7, factor 8, or factor 8 and factor 9, I should say, which is, if you think about it, it's really amazing to have patients who their whole life had to manage bleeding with these constant infusions. To have a complete disappearance of that requirement is really as transformative as it gets. It's kind of what medicine is all about. And I think this is kind of, I think people in investing kind of understand this is going on, but because, there's some Pfizer ownership of some of this stuff, it's not greatly appreciated. And of course, what's interesting is Sangamo and Spark actually still own 100% of one of the two big hemophilia markets. So Spark actually still owns 100% of their hemophilia A drug, and Sangamo actually owns 100% of their hemophilia B drug. And I could see both of these companies be acquired for much, much higher stock price than where they're at now. Also, uniQure is sort of a dark horse here. It's trading at close to zero enterprise value, so I actually kind of think it's still pretty attractive. There's still some questions, like Baxter, I think, had a gene therapy drug, and we have to look at that. Not all of these drugs are created equally. It's also unknown whether or not they'll be really great long-term drugs, but I like all three of these companies. I think these are huge game changers. Hemophilia patients are really sort of have a terrible illness where they have to take these IVs twice a week, 3 times a week, 4 times a week, and for their whole lives. And these are medicines that with one injection, Spark saw 100% disappearance of factor usage, which if you think about it is really, I mean, such a miracle. It's I don't think the market's really truly appreciated the kind of upside that exists here. So
yeah, the keto for epilepsy makes sense.
Also very thin.
Yeah, type 2 just doesn't work that way. Yeah. It's African Americans have large disparity with respect to both nephropathy, cardiovascular illness, and even diabetes. Some of the genetics are very interesting. Did you know that there's a gene called APOL1, which only African Americans have? And what it does is it kills, it's really fascinating. It's a protein your body makes, your genes make, and it kills African sleeping sickness bug called trypanosomus. So it's very good at that, and it makes sense why it was evolved, because that bug happens to live in Africa.
Interesting.
And it can kill you. And so what African Americans evolved is APOL1, and it's fantastic at killing this bug. It also is fantastic at causing kidney disease. So so white people don't have this. Many black people are immune to African sleeping sickness because, for evolutionary reasons, obviously. Very preferential if you could kill this thing on your own, that's a huge problem in these countries, is that bug, as are other bugs like malaria and so forth. So Africa happens to have a really interesting, diversity of species and things like that Africa has all of these things. Oh my God, what?
Yeah, she was fat, dude.
Okay, so this makes sense. The fact that she had type 2 diabetes and she's gotten over it. I think that's really inspiring, going to be inspiring for a lot of people. It's great.
That's how
Even when I was 9 months pregnant, I was not that bad.
Yeah, exactly. So look, I mean, honestly, that's clearly she's going to be effective at being a spokesperson for getting over type 2 diabetes.
She lost all her booty though. That's not good.
When I learned about APOL1 nephropathy, because if you guys don't know, I developed the first drug for FSGS, another kidney disease. And I was looking at APOL1 nephropathy very carefully because a substantial percentage of the people on dialysis are African American. It doesn't make any sense because if you know the statistics, it's just very strange, this phenomenon.
Yeah.
And explaining it is very difficult. A lot of people are tempted to explain it through socioeconomic reasons, that it's more people, poverty, for instance, that just eat bad and stuff like that, but it still wouldn't account for it. And it turns out that it actually is to do with the heritage. And what's interesting is every race has all these interesting facets to it. Like landlocked areas have genetic diseases because of inbreeding. Poor areas, like Kentucky, even like Kentucky, is a poor. Yeah, like people don't leave Kentucky, so it's a very poor state, Kentucky and Mississippi, and so they. It turns out that they often will have higher incidences of genetic diseases because the gene pool is very finite, and that's obviously in the U.S., which has no racial real identity. It's a melting pot. Then you've got even places like the Dominican Republic, Saudi Arabia, entire Jewish communities have dramatic amounts of these rare diseases, but some of them are fixed within specific populations. Italians have a high incidence of this rare neurological genetic disease. Type 1 diabetes is extremely high in Nordic countries, of all things. Because the bugs have existed in Africa for thousands of years, whereas for tens of thousands of years, well, the whole socioeconomic thing is pretty recent. Like all that stuff's very recent. And evolution works over thousands and thousands of years, not over hundreds of years. So, it's just to me like there's all of these worms and bugs in Africa that you won't find anywhere else in the world. And just the evolving of mechanisms to innately fight against them is fascinating. And that also happens when people relocate. If you go from one continent to the other, you're going to face all these new organisms that you never seen before. Not just you, but your entire lineage has never seen before, and they can be deadly.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts. And what's amazing is that humans never really lived very long and thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. So making this poisonous APOL1, your body thought it was a pretty good idea because, your kidneys don't matter anyway because you're not going to live to be 50 years old.
Yeah.
So might as well have a little thing that causes kidney disease over the really long run, but at least kills the bug over the short run. And then the bug gets exterminated through sanitary, conditions and things like that. And now you're stuck with this bug-killing, kidney-killing thing that you kind of don't want. And I've thought about making an antibody to this specific thing. It probably would work pretty well, but funding is limited, and that's one of the reasons I've always wanted to raise prices of drugs, make more money, and do research like this. But in some ways, if we prioritize the very best ideas, and I went after this other kidney disease, which also has a gigantic African-American disposition. In fact, the two most well-known sufferers of focal segmental glomerulosclerosis are Alonzo Mourning, who was a basketball god, and he was a great player for the Heat, and I think he played on the Knicks briefly. And he had it, and he had to leave.
No, he was on the Nets.
Oh, okay.
When they were still in Jersey. Yeah.
Interesting. I don't remember it, I guess, but and I know he was on the Heat. That's where he was when I think he won the NBA Finals with the Heat, but I don't know.
Yeah, he did. That's definite.
Oh, cool. And then he had to leave the NBA because of this illness, and then he survived. I think he's been transplanted. And transplants only last 15 years, and they come with a host of other illnesses. The medicine you have to take with it, etc. And most people can't get through more than one transplant. But if you're on a second transplant, so if you get transplanted when you're 40, or I think you got it when he's 35. Now you're 50 and you need a second transplant. Now you're dealing with two of somebody else's organs in your body. It's very tough, and you're susceptible to infections and cancer and things like that. And, it's a tough illness. The other person is Gary Coleman, who's the primary care, ideally even before the drug that I came up with, is steroids. So Gary Coleman took steroids most of his life, and it's part of the reason he was so short. Yeah, the guy from, was it Three's Company? What? No.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I mean,
Different strokes.
Different Strokes. Yeah. Different Strokes.
Three's Company, Jack Tripper.
Yeah, totally off there, but Different Strokes. And what was his famous line? What you talking about, Willis? Right?
Yeah, what you talking about?
And so
Wait, so he died from that?
he died from steroid complications and things like that, and heart failure, and I mean it's a huge number of illnesses that come at you when you have a disease like that. This is where FSGS is where the kidneys scar. Nobody understands why, and you just get this deep scarring in the kidney. I don't think you do. FSGS, you just have this progressive, interminable scarring that just accumulates, and then eventually your kidneys don't work. You need a transplant, or dialysis. Dialysis, a lot of people don't know, it's a 5-year average survival
it's pretty much a death sentence. Obviously, it's a 2-week death sentence if you don't do it, but it's not, it's not like dialysis is it'll prolong your life, but it doesn't save your life. And so, it's a kidney disease is something that is close to me. So I endowed the NYU professor of nephrology, because kidney disease is nephrology. And, it's a little organ that a lot of people don't really think about. And, I've happened to learn a lot about it. But, the liver has the same stuff, the lungs have the same stuff, the skin has the same stuff. It's quite a cool field, and, the industry is doing a great job. Maybe I'm not, but the industry is doing a great job coming up with some good drugs. And this girl I really want to date had a kidney transplant as well. So that was part of my inspiration for going into that field.
Aww.
Yeah. But it's the biotech kind of thing has been tremendous for all kinds of people that never would have had a chance to be healthy, and it's just a wonderful industry. A lot of people kind of get it twisted, and unfortunately I've not done it any favors, which is a shame, because I really do think I embody the beneficial parts of our industry. Oh well, c'est la vie. Ain't my problem. Well, I guess, depends on how you look at it.